Hi, good morning. It's Graham Fisher, Chief Exec of Orange Genie Group, and hopefully you've logged on to get the latest news on the public sector reforms. As you will be aware, HM Treasury issued the Finance Bill on Monday, which contained the final version of the legislation relating to the workers' services provided to the public sector through intermediaries. The purpose of this webinar is to summarise the impact of the legislation, what you need to do, and what progress is being made towards its introduction in just under 3 weeks. While I run through the slides, should take about 25, maybe 30 minutes, I will put you on mute. You can use the chat box on the right to ask questions as we go. I'll take further questions at the end. Webinar is being recorded and we'll send you a link after the session and provide you with the slides and answers to all questions asked. Okay, here's the agenda I propose to run through. I'm not intending to go through the history of how we've got here or look back on the issues I've raised before. I'll try and focus on the implications and impacts of the final published legislation. There's still a few loose ends we can't answer at the moment, and we'll have to wait for the final version of the guidance notes whenever they're published, hopefully in April, although knowing HMRC it could be maybe next year, who knows. Okay, I'd like to get started by clarifying who's in scope of the legislation. I particularly want to focus on outsourced services because we're receiving more questions on that topic than anything else. I'm sure many see this as a get out of jail free card or a way to get around the legislation, but for most it isn't. Before clarifying the definition, I thought it might help if I shared the address of a website we found that will help in identifying public sector bodies. It's www.whatdotheyknow.com. It is searchable and lists all 19,233 public sector bodies subject to the Freedom of Information Acts. There was a minor extension to the public sector bodies in the final legislation. They included 4 more organisations: Corporate Office of the House of Commons, Corporate Office of the House of Lords, and the Welsh and Northern Ireland commissions. But broadly, it's exactly as we expected. Just to go over this once more, to identify if a relevant supply chain is in scope of these regulations, you should be looking for 3 components. They all need to be present in a supply chain for the legislation to be triggered. First, there obviously has to be a public sector body. Second, there has to be an intermediary, generally a personal service company, but it could be a partnership or an unincorporated association. And thirdly, there must be a personal service. In other words, if the intermediary wasn't there, the worker would be treated as an employee. I'd like to focus on the intermediary. We've seen and heard that some contractors believe if they get together with other contractors, they will be outside the legislation because they're no longer a personal service company, but that isn't the case. We've all tended to use the term PSC for convenience, and I know I've done it on the next slide. An intermediary can have any number of directors or shareholders. The key definition is whether the contractor owns 5% or more of the company. Now, turning to the issue of outsourcing, we've seen and heard a number of really ill-informed assumptions being made, and heard that many players, and that includes public sector bodies, agencies and contractors, are seeking to exploit this apparent exemption. Obviously it's the one highlighted with the pretty black ring around it. The exemption is available because the use of an outsourced service provider breaks the supply chain. So the 3 components of PSB, intermediary and worker aren't present. the top of the chain isn't the public sector body, it's the outsourced service supplier, a private sector body, and thus outside the new legislation. To be an outsourced supplier, although it is complex, a relatively simple test is to look at three elements. Firstly, who is responsible for the deliverables? The total responsibility for deliverables, often confirmed in a statement of works, must be managed and controlled and delivered by the outsourced supplier. Secondly, financial risk. The financial risk must be taken by the supplier. And thirdly, there must be a clear intention, supported by contract, that both parties intended this to be an outsourced supply. If we just look at the financial risk, and I can probably give you a good example, that if you have taken a contract to clean offices, for an example, if you've got a statement of work that tells you how often you should clean the windows, how often the desk should be polished, and so on, and it doesn't matter how many people, how many cleaners and so on you employ, then you're starting to look at something that is probably covered by a statement of works. And the real test of this is that if you, let's assume for a moment that the contract requires 10 workers, if you put 12 workers on the job, then you will lose money. If you put 8 workers on the job and you can still meet the contract, the statement of works, then you'll make a profit. And it's that financial risk that's really important. If you're being paid on a time and rate basis, there's no way that the contract is going to be an outsourced supplier contract. I hope that clarifies it. If anyone's got questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I've just put this slide in because I thought it might be useful to put some context into the presentation. Hopefully these three calculations ensure we all understand why so many contractors are deeply concerned and the potential dramatic effect these changes could have on hirers' costs or contractors' take-home pay. Public sector contractors could be hit from three sides: inside IR35 and the deemed employment calculation, loss of the flat rate VAT scheme benefits, which also comes in actually from the 1st of April, and the loss of the 5% expense allowance. So if you just look at these, in particular, if we look at the lower paid example, I've called them a health worker, but it could be a supply teacher, a social worker, or any lower paid contractor. The uplift requirement, that's the box on the right, of 30% would give them the same take-home pay as before. And the before being the left-hand one pre-April 2017. You can see that if you've got to start increasing rates by 30%, that's a pretty devastating amount of money for the public sector to find or for the contractor to have to pay. Add the current uncertainty and we all begin to understand the consequences of this piece of legislation. Let's now move on to the IR35 assessment process. I've got to say, at last, I remember having a meeting with the implementation team of HMRC in January, beginning of January, and they promised that the duty of care would be included in the next iteration of the legislation, which they actually said would be out before the end of January. So I was beginning to doubt what I was saying. However, legislation finally made it clear that the public sector bodies are responsible for the assessment of IR35, and they have also been given a deadline for decision making. For contracts entered into after the 6th of April, they have a duty to provide the assessment on or before the time of entry into the contract, in other words, when someone signs the contract, or if the services begin at a later time, before the later time. quite why anyone would accept a contract whenever it's being performed without knowing how much they will earn is quite beyond me, unless they work on the assumption that the contract is inside IR35. Of course, we were expecting that there would be a duty of care placed on the public sector body. Unfortunately, we only got reasonable care, which is not as strong as we were hoping. Nevertheless, this and a requirement to have a clear decision-making process in place has squarely placed the onus of decision-making with the public sector body. Unfortunately, although not mandatory, the use of the online tool makes sense, because assuming the questions have been answered correctly, HMRC will provide safe harbour and guarantee of no investigations. The tool is fundamentally flawed, it continues to give inaccurate results, and the chat boxes are alive with contractors and consultants suggesting how to answer questions to get the right result, although the decision plainly is up to the public sector body. I am aware that some public sector bodies are retaining private sector experts, the likes of Barron, Cottrell and Kudos, to carry out the assessments rather than using the employment status service, but they are testing their assumptions, their conclusions against the online tool, and they tell me they continue to get wrong decisions. So there's a lot wrong with this, with the employment status service. I think it's just fundamentally flawed, and at some time, I've no doubt, someone will take the service to court, no doubt backed by someone like IPSI, because I still do not believe, and I don't think anybody who is familiar with this area believes that it is giving correct decisions. It's almost taking the place of what IR35 used to be to this new interpretation of what HMRC want it to be. If you or your contractor disagree with the assessment, you can write and ask for the reasons, and the public sector body has 31 days to respond. Now that's not the same as an appeal process. They can respond, they can give you the reasons as to why they've reached that decision, but they don't have to do anything about it. So I think in this particular slide, we've moved on to appeal and risk management. Appeal is more, the most appropriate word is probably influence. So the only appeals process within the legislation relates to over or underpayment of tax. It's available to the contractor through the annual self-assessment process. There's still an element of risk sitting with you as the fee payer. If the public sector body incorrectly assesses the assignment and you have information that would lead them to a different conclusion, you should declare it. Similarly, if the contractor is aware of the information, they must declare it. A failure to do so could be fraudulent under the legislation and could leave you with the liability. So we're suggesting to everybody that they should be putting some robust processes in place. There is a balance between practicality and risk, but nevertheless we think on balance you should be doing this. In the unlikely event that HMRC open an investigation, you are seen to have acted correctly. Truth is, you're protecting yourself against subsequent case law that might define what reasonable care looks like. So if we look at that, the second bullet point, the fee payer must implement own robust processes. What we're suggesting, you must understand from the public sector body what their assessment process is, and you need to understand if that includes the employment status service, because obviously again you've got that guarantee from HMRC. But you should be seen, you need to retain the public sector body's assessment. You need to actually just have some form of process, and if you can actually demonstrate this has been done, it would help you enormously. Is that assessment reasonable? You can test it against other examples. Have a discussion with the contractor, and if you disagree, request the reasons as to how they reach that decision. Actually work with the contractor and get the contractor to retake the employment status service test and retain that. Also, you can obtain a third-party assessment, and this is particularly when the public sector body has said it's inside and the contractor believes it's outside, and then nicely request the public sector body to undertake a reassessment. They don't have to do that, so it's about you trying to influence them to do it. If you keep all of that information available, that will evidence that you've got a process in place. If you fundamentally disagree with the assessment made by the public sector body, you can, of course, use your own assessment and pay contractors gross against the public sector body's advice. But beware, this is a high-risk strategy, although if successful, it will make your contractor a lower cost option and remove risk from the public sector body. There are agencies that we're aware of and that we're working with retaining independent experts to provide an assessment service, but beware. Of course, the contractor can attempt to claim back tax paid under the IR35 through the annual assessment process. Actually, there's little downside, and I have no doubt that some will be encouraged to appeal. That will cause HMRC huge problems because they don't have any resource to undertake the appeals process. Okay, so if we now just turn to the deemed employment process, clearly if you're the fee payer, you need to ensure your processes and software are aligned with the deemed employment calculation. There was one key change to the legislation that wasn't expected by everyone, and it revolved around chain payments. Some of you may recall when the Onshore Intermediaries Act came into being in 2014, the construction industry moved virtually overnight and placed all contractors into umbrella employment as opposed to self-employment. But they failed to pass the employer's national insurance contributions down the chain. When contractors got their first pay packet, there was uproar as they received 13.8% less than they had received the previous week. Umbrella companies took the brunt of the criticism, in truth, for doing their job properly. Clearly, HMRC have been reminded of the experience and have now legislated that the employer's national insurance contribution, and probably incidentally the apprenticeship levy, although we won't know until we see the guidance notes coming out, but they've legislated that the NI contribution cannot be deducted from the rate agreed with the contractor and must be paid by the fee payer and not deducted from the chain payment to the contractor. In reality, most agencies offer contractors either a PAYE rate or an uplifted limited company rate. If so, under your force majeure contract clause, if you haven't already done it, you'll need to advise your contractors that you are lowering their rate by moving it from the limited company rate to the PAYE rate. Actually quite logical, because the deemed employment calculation is a close equivalent to PAYE. Of course, the alternative is for the agency to absorb the cost or seek to get a higher rate from the public sector body. And this may be necessary if the contractor decides to walk away from the contract. Some of you may be using a payment intermediary to carry out the deemed calculation and pay contractors. It's important to be clear there are two forms to their services. Firstly, an outsourced service provider, and secondly, a supply chain partner. The outsourced service leaves you as the fee payer, accepting all the risks, however small. The supply chain partner requires the intermediary to step into the supply chain and contractually sit between you and your contractors' companies. they will be affected by the employer's national insurance change. And we are aware that at least 2 have not allowed for its payment and assumed it will be paid by the contractor. So you need to check your arrangements if you've entered into that sort of deal. Okay, you've seen this slide before. I don't intend to go over it again. It's there to stimulate any questions you might have on the actual calculations. I've actually removed from that slide double taxation. I didn't think we'd need to go into that today. And at the moment, the double taxation provisions haven't been changed and still don't work. So we're expecting something else on that in due course. However, before I move on, the last point, particularly on employment rights, there's been some concern expressed following the Uber, Deliveroo and Pimlico Plumber rulings about contractors seeking to go down the same route and claiming the employment rights. For this reason, I have been in meetings with public sector bodies who are sensibly pushing contractors down the umbrella route just in case. Okay, so what should be happening now? And to be fair, there are a number of public sector bodies and agencies who are prepared, carrying out assessments, making decisions on rates and informing contractors. However, there are 19,233 public sector bodies and some 10 staff in the HMRC implementation team with responsibility to develop and introduce best practice processes to the public sector bodies. So I'm sorry to say the experience is that a large minority, and I'm being kind, of public sector bodies are either unaware or not prepared for the change. So we're seeing, I'm going to say everything that I've got on the screen there, but included with that, of course, is that the Employment Status Service continues to produce inaccurate assessments. That is particularly true where we believe that somebody is outside and they're now being pushed inside, and we've got some very clear cases where someone who we are certain is inside is shown to be outside. There's lots of tax loss insurance models emerging. That's always a bad sign because that means there's a huge failure in the market. Contractor chat boards are on fire with how do I answer the questions to make sure I get outside, and there are widespread attempts to exploit outsourcing loophole. There's a real fear of retrospective investigations, and contractors are not making decisions. We and all of our competitors are having hundreds of phone calls from contractors at the moment who really don't know what to do and don't know which direction to jump in. And I think you need to probably help them. You need to be aware that there are some new umbrella models emerging, and for that reason HMRC have been increasing their activities and issuing warnings on some of those models. And they have reminded us that there is a new piece of legislation, which is the corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion, that will come into place, I think it's in July. And if you are seen to be complicit with a tax evasion scheme, the fines are unlimited, and I believe it includes jail for the more unfortunate of us. So due diligence is really important. It's always your best defence. If you haven't already got a closed preferred supplier list, we strongly recommend you develop one. HMRC are very proactive on the tax evasion and tax avoidance schemes. Okay, finally, I'm not sure I want to read all of this out, but I thought I'd just put out sort of a 10-point plan as to what I think you should be doing. Hopefully you've at least got to about number 6 or number 7, but you need to start getting the contractors to make decisions. And so we've got, all of us have got very, very large pipelines of contractors who just don't know what to do. Some of them will be yours. The fear we're going to get is that we'll get to the 6th of April, hundreds of contractors will still not have made a decision and they won't get paid. We just need to try and help them along as best we can. Okay, and in terms of where we are, again, I apologise, you've seen this slide before. We continue to push our business as usual models. Orange Genie compliance, we have been visiting and are undertaking quite a lot of work with agencies and public sector bodies, and we do have a payment intermediary model. Actually, we use Remit, which is provided by Professional Passport, if any of you know them. Okay, that is it. Thank you very much for listening, and now we'll start to try and answer some questions. I think my finance director, Ross Baker, I hope will appear from a next door office and help me with some of the questions and answers if I can't understand them. Okay, so we've got one. Is the recording going to be made available today? It will be available. It will be available today. Slides will be done, and we will answer any questions that come up if we haven't managed to answer them now. So I've got a question here. Private sector companies have integrated partnerships with the public authority client and supply staff rather than services with deliverables would be in scope, even though the contract to provide the staff could be regarded as an outsourced project. I think, Dean, I'm not sure whether you're answering a question or giving me the answer, but if the deliverable is about the supply of staff, then yes, it is in scope. That would not be regarded as an outsourced project. And I've got Ross nodding his head going, yep, that's the correct answer. Is there any recourse if the public sector body puts a blanket inside IR35? There isn't, because there isn't an appeals process. And this is where my view is that you should be trying to use your powers of persuasion to get them to think about that. To me, it's generally a sign that they're not prepared for the change and they've made a knee-jerk reaction. But having said that, I'm going to say that we are aware that HMRC themselves have made a blanket decision that everybody is inside IR35, so they haven't themselves undertaken any assessment. It is a blanket decision. If you've got a good relationship with them, I think you should talk it through with them. Yeah. HMRC changing questions and sequence to put pressure on departments to rule inside since tool release. HMRC, just hang on, I need to think about that one. HMRC changing questions and sequence. Oh, is that? Yeah, is that? Yes, I'm guessing that that is on the employment service status, the online tool. Look, everyone that understands IR35 is, if I say aghast, I'm not sure whether we're aghast or actually pleased in some ways. They've gone very heavily on substitution, and if you answer, I think it's about 3 questions within substitutions, if I say correctly, then it will automatically at the moment bring up an answer that you're outside. And that's really the area where we see so many mistakes and errors being made. It doesn't help that the questions aren't particularly easy to interpret what they actually mean. So fundamentally, we believe that the tool is flawed. It will change. They will keep on changing the questions and answers. if at the moment too many people are getting through, I've no doubt that will stimulate the next change, because I'm sure their target is to get to 90% are inside IR35. So those of us that understand this, we're sitting there going, this isn't right. Yeah, so pressure is being put on departments, I've no doubt at all. Employer NI, can you explain this more, please? Okay, sorry, this is broken into two. Typically, the umbrella would calculate the employer NI element and reduce the contractor rate accordingly. Is this no longer an option? I'm going to say that's correct. This is no longer an option. Where the contractor, or where the assignment is ruled to be inside IR35, the rate that you have agreed with the contractor is the rate on which the employee's national insurance and PAYE calculation has to be based. You cannot deduct from that calculation any employer's national insurance, either before or after its calculation. It has to be paid by the fee payer. So it is really important that if you think you're in that situation where you have assumed that the contractor would effectively absorb the employer's national insurance through the calculation, that you go back to the contractor and negotiate down their rate, because you can't do that anymore.
Or use the umbrella.
Sorry, and Ross is rightly saying, or use the umbrella model. So yeah, sorry, Ross is saying it is an option correctly to use the umbrella model, and because of the nature of the way in which we contract, we would be able to do it through the umbrella model. Umbrella, of course, is outside the scope of these regulations, which gives the umbrella more freedom. Okay, REC are suggesting indemnity clauses if a worker is deemed outside of scope and subsequently investigated to be inside. Is the indemnity clause enforceable? James, the answer to that is I don't know. I do not believe that if it got to court, that the judge would look very favourably on that type of indemnity clause, and particularly one where someone is using their dominant position to exploit others. So I've no doubt the indemnity clause will sit in there, and we'll just have to wait for a case ruling as to whether it's enforceable or not. As I say, my belief is it won't be, but we won't know until it all goes wrong. Right, can you provide any further clarity regarding the definition of outsourced supplier and the use of them, meaning IR35 is not applicable? Does this mean providers such as Commensura, Pontoon, etc. are out of scope? Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that directly at the moment. Truth is, I don't know exactly how Commensura and Pontoon work as to whether it's inside or outside. But the fact is that if it's about the two expressions are, if it's about body shopping or putting bums on seats, it doesn't matter how you dress it up, it won't get you out of scope. I always think the real big test is there real financial risk sitting in that supply chain with the outsourced supplier? If there isn't, or it's been dressed up to look as if there is, then it will fail and it will be in scope. Okay, so there's another question here that's relevant to that. If a contractor is on a time and day rate basis, then they cannot be deemed as an outsourced solution provider. Phil, that is absolutely correct. Okay, so yeah, that's correct, they can't be. Okay, so I think I've answered all of the questions at the moment. So Dean, I see you're saying, wow, significant. I think it's really significant. And as I say, I think there are one or two payment intermediaries have run themselves into trouble on this, and that we were hesitating on whether to do this or not because we were thinking this might happen, and it has. It's made it difficult, but we use Remit, so that's not a problem to us. Okay. I don't think. Oh, sorry. I've got one more question here. The end client has taken reasonable care and stated that they fall outside IR35, but we have found them to fall inside. Where does the financial liability lie with us or the end client? Yeah. Okay. In answering that question strictly, it is the fee payer. So because you're actually, in a sense, overruling what the public sector body has said by saying, no, they are, we think it's the other way around. In reality, what you should do is try and go back to the public sector body and influence them and ask them to look again with whatever the new facts are, or if you've got a third-party report stating that it's outside, your best bet really is to try and go back to the public sector body and get them to change their view, because then the liability sits with them. If you overrule it, you may well be correct. It's not the end of the world, but you are substantially increasing your risk. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologise. I've misread that question. Ross has just pointed out to me. If the end client has taken reasonable care and stated that they fall outside, but we have found them to fall inside, where does the financial liability lie? Sorry, I think, yeah, it sits with the fee payer, but in this case, that is a pretty risk-averse position to be in, because obviously the correct taxes are being paid. So there really wouldn't be a liability there, but I'm going to go back and say, but it would be extremely helpful in my view and would add value to your client if you went back to them and discussed why you thought it was inside as opposed to outside. Sorry, I got that one a little bit wrong. Okay, if that's all the questions. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm just waiting another couple of seconds in case anyone thinks of anything that they might have forgotten or misunderstood. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.